Hello, this is Henry Crane, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation on my two recently released books, People I've Seen and Late in the Years. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about some of the lessons I learned about creating artwork and myself while making these projects, as well as some of the inspirations behind the pieces of artwork, some of the techniques I used to create the images, and what motivated me to start making these books in the first place, considering I'd never made anything on this scale before. Before I begin, I really want to thank everyone who joined me today for this presentation. These books took a really long time to work on, and while making them, I even was wondering how much attention or recognition they'd get once they were finished. So doing a presentation on them today is definitely a career high point for me. So these books altogether took about 2.5 years, starting with the first comic Late in the Years, and then People I've Seen, which began like a year and a half into making the first comic. So the idea for Late in the Years all began while I was on a walk at night in upstate New York. I was on a trip at that time, and I had recently turned 21 a couple weeks before, and I was just thinking about a lot of decisions I had to make at that point in time in my life, considering that I just decided to leave art school and become an EMT. I was happy about making these choices, but I felt like I just needed something going on in my life that was going to put me on a really good trajectory for making artwork as a career in the future. I had thought about making a comic for a long time up to that point, and thought that would be a really good idea, considering it would almost be like a sellable portfolio, which I could use to show potential people in the future so I could get consignments and work like that. What had been stopping me from so long from starting a comic was I think I was just overthinking the entire process. I think it was something I was spending a lot more time like dreaming about than actually doing. And I got so sick of feeling like, this is something out of my reach. I just decided that all I'd have to do is just make a comic that it could be completed in a relatively short amount of time, and not worry too much about it being any sort of masterpiece. So when I got back to my cabin, this is the first page that I ended up drawing. My original idea had been about making a comic on what I'd just been doing pretty much before I started drawing. About a comic about someone on a walk in the woods who suddenly gets lost and falls down a hill and drowns. But the thing about the story is that all the symbolism will be told very much through the line work. So I really like that idea of someone getting lost. And the way I wanted to capture that is have the lines when the person is less lost at the beginning of the comic be much more like distinct and clear. And then as they go deeper into the woods, the lines become a lot thicker and more inkier, almost like the reader is like drowning in the comic along with the main character. I thought this idea was really interesting, but I felt like it didn't have enough of a narrative. So I stuck with that idea of doing a comic on someone getting lost and tried to expand upon that. One of the other symbols in the comic that I really wanted to work with was like someone making a decision that led them to being lost that they have to stick with. And I felt like doing a comic to do with older people would be interesting, because that's like a group of people that's very stuck with all the choices they've made and have to think about them for the remainder of their life. And so I made the comic about this old man who goes, originally the comic was about this old man that goes on this journey to see this abandoned train that he heard of, and then someone who accompanies him and is curious just about why he's interested in even doing this. And that was originally where this image came from, of the two people walking through the gate together, which interestingly enough, when I settled on what the final comic idea would be, became like a really repetitive theme of this gate and people moving through it. But originally it was really nothing. It was originally for this other idea. So once I had that all put together, I started piecing the story more and trying to make it something more complete, and change the idea to be about a man and a woman who live together and see this line of smoke that appears every year, which the old man obsesses about. and makes the choice to go find the origin of, and sort of gets stuck in the process of doing that and has to make a clear choice of how far he wants to go in investigating the source of that ignition. So I started writing that plot out a lot more, and making a lot of note pages on it. To be completely honest, I really had no clear idea about how to make a comic at this time. I was getting all these ideas going, but I really had no clear way of starting, or knew like if I should start with the plot or the drawings or what. I settled on really trying to stick with the plot because I felt like if I much knew what the story was I wanted to tell, all the drawings could be in some way kind of like, they would be a lot more free form. Like if I just knew what the plot was in the text, I could have made the story like takes place in space if I wanted to. So I continued making a lot of notes in this comic and was asking myself questions like, why does one of the people want to turn back? Or just notes about some of the rough drafts I've been doing, like wanting to make the characters more distinguishable. If you see here, while I was making this comic, I barely even knew what type of material to use. I was suggesting at this point drawing everything on Bristol board, which I pretty sure I did at the first pages, but then I started using watercolor paper. Another note you'll see on this page is this one, which says you can draw something way better than that, which I was a little bit embarrassed to put in this presentation at first, but I decided it was worth showing everyone because I think this really encapsulates the frame of mind I was in when I was starting this comic. I was honestly not confident about it. I knew it was something I really wanted to do, but when I started this, I by no means was feeling extraordinarily sure of my artwork and then the idea in general. And as I've grown in doing art, my attitude is much more changed to be a lot more accepting and open-minded of the challenges I take, because I think having this harsh attitude towards yourself, especially when you're just getting really, really into art, I think all it does is hold you back, make you feel less creative, and try less. So I'm glad I don't feel like I do anymore. The other thing I started doing is, since I was not in art school anymore, I acknowledged that I still had a lot of things I wanted to improve with my artwork. So I started going to the sketch club, which is off of Locust Street between like 12th and 13th Street in Center City, Philadelphia. And at the sketch club there, they had like 3-hour or so still life drawing sessions that were only $8. And it was a really great way to improve my drawing. I really wanted to do it because I just knew that this comic would require me to be able to draw so many different forms of people. And I really wanted to make sure I had a good understanding of that for when I started drawing the actual comic. So once I had the plot outline all together, I then started considering like, what point of view do I want this to be told from? And I thought it could be interesting to make it from the man's point of view, just because he's more of like the source of the story, like is driving more of the story. But I like the idea of it being from the woman's perspective, because in some way I think it's much more relatable to have this person in your life that's like making all these really extreme or confusing decisions and trying to stick with them in like while they're working, sorting out their problems and just sort of getting stuck in the problem with them. And not only for that reason, but I also just think it made the story a lot more interesting, because you would be able to see it unfold at like a slower pace. And then when you get to the climax, you would be realizing it with the man. So I think in the context of the story, it just made more sense to be from her perspective. Once I'd had all that figured out and I'd wrote the text down, I then finally started on the thumbnail sketches, which you'll see on the right page here. As I said, I was really originally wanting this to be done in like 6 months or so. But when I started these thumbnail sketches, I realized it was going to take much longer. And that was partially because I'd had this style I'd been working with drawing way before I started my comic. But I just want to make sure I had a really good understanding of how I was going to approach all of these images and like what type of inking I was going to use and just what techniques I was going to produce all these images using. So once I had all the text together and the rough draft pages drawn out, I then started laying them over top each other in a program called GIMP, which is pretty much like a free version of Photoshop if you're unfamiliar. And doing this was really helpful because I was able to plan out a lot more of the drawings. And once I finally got to the stage of drawing the final images, I was able to think through like all the details I was using and if there was just any way I could make the drawings much more interesting. For example, with the first page, I had drawn that black spot on the pillow, which was supposed to represent a person who'd left the bed. And then when I did the final drawing, I actually could like expand upon that and be like, wow, that would be more interesting if it was like a complete shadow of a person there. And yeah, so as you see here, some of them ended up being very similar. With some of the other pages, I was able to take some of the compositions that I'd already been using, like the woman in the woods here, and just experiment more with it and see if I could make it much more interesting, as well as like improve some of the backgrounds and things like that. I also knew that by doing all these drawings, although it took time, like a lot of time, it in the end, I think also just helped me improve my skills so much overall. With some of the later pages in the comic, you can see they completely drifted away from the original draft pages. And this was partially because my skills started improving so much more. And I was at that point able to figure out a lot more interesting ways to approach these drawings, but also because I started realizing that I liked my art when it was a lot less to do with like the literal narrative of the story I was trying to represent, and more just the symbolism that I was trying to capture, and focusing more on that to drive the story than just the literal context of what was going on in the text. So I now want to go through some of the individual pages from late in the years and talk about some of the lessons I learned with them. For the first page, I want to begin by talking about a story about showing my artwork to an old teacher of mine and his reaction to it. So by the time I showed it to him, I think I'd completed about 4 or 5 pages of the book, and I was feeling really happy about it. Like I was getting a pretty good reaction from the people I'd shown it to, but I just was interested in having some critiques on it. And so when I showed it to him, to my surprise, he was not nearly as encouraging about the idea of me pursuing art on my own and teaching myself as I expected he was going to be. In fact, after he looked at them, he didn't think I had much potential to do art on my own and was like really pursuing me to come back to art school. And when I asked him why he felt this way, his responses were very much more to do with my skill set that was shown in my drawings rather than the actual concepts of the drawings. Like it was kind of like he was seeing the artwork I was making as though it should be a complete representation of how well I could draw parts of the body, rather than like what was the imagery saying. An example of this was the cheekbone on the woman's face. I very much remember him pointing that out and saying to me how I just couldn't capture the form of the zygomatic process accurately, and a lot of other comments like that. And in the end, after I had had dinner with him and thought about everything he'd said to me, the other important lesson I really learned from that interaction with him is that in the end, you are going to know your own artwork best. There's always going to be someone who has the proper words, or you might feel they have the proper words to explain it or some type of insight. But if you feel that you have a vision that you're enjoying creating, I think that's what's going to matter the most. The other thing talking to him made me realize was that if I wasn't prioritizing capturing the form in every single one of these drawings, then the biggest challenge for me was how was I then going to go about capturing the aesthetic I wanted. And this especially started with figuring out the typography. I'd originally used like a Times New Roman font for the text, and it looked interesting, but it was like almost a little too like clinical feeling with the handmade feel of the rest of the comic. So I then tried doing everything in actual handwriting, and that just felt too much done by hand. So the middle ground I found was taking uniform text that already exists, and tracing over it and adding like slight changes, personal touches to it, and then scanning it and using it that way, because it still had that uniform feel to it, but it felt much more like hand done. And what I did originally was I took the whole alphabet and scanned that, and took the whole alphabet, drew over that, and then would rearrange all these letters in GIMP. And that's what this program is right here that you see. I would like individually use the select tool, copy them, and then line them all up to make the sentences. And what I would do is I'd take all the previous sentences I'd done and like use repeating ones. So like BL, if that was in like a different word, I just copy it and move it. So it took a lot of time in all, but I think the effects really paid off. So when I got to pages 2 and 3, that's when I started really figuring out a lot of the graphic design for the images, like how I was going to lay all the comic panels out. I was still learning a lot at this stage. And I'm happy with the results here, but I remember even, for example, trying to figure out like if I should use actual bubbles or just like squares there. So I was still kind of like working out the kinks of the entire comic on these pages. But at the same time, I think all the time I put into improving my skill set had really paid off, because I felt pretty confident what I was doing after like months and months of preparing just to start. On page 4 and 5, I started really solidifying that pen and ink style I was using. But the thing that started, problem that started coming up for me was figuring out how to control the white space in a lot of the drawing. Particularly, I remember on the smoke coming out of the mountains here, I liked the way it looked, but I just wished I had a little bit more control of the white lines there. And so what I started doing on the 5th page is I got like a white acrylic and then a white gel pen, and was able to start drawing in the white space that I wanted, such as on the tree or the smoke there, tree here, or the gate I meant, or the spider web. And this might seem like a little detail about use of medium, but this little addition is what really led me to figuring out how to paint and do other things like that later on in the comic. So on page 6 and 8, what I was, the next challenge I was trying to overcome was figuring out how I could make things feel lifelike, but still have like a surreal feel to them. So for example, on the dress, it might seem very stylistic in the way I drew this, but it was much more out of necessity. Since I wasn't painting and all I had was like sharp pen lines, I tried to figure out how could I make this look lifelike while still having like some type of unnatural touch to it. And that's where I started using much more of this like long streak effect with the drawings, where it would be like hyper detailed and feel like very fine and lifelike, but still have this like unnatural, lively quality to it. And you can see that on the leg and the varicose veins and everything. The really important thing about page 6 that changed so much of the comic for me was literally just figuring out how to do the grass. I had originally drawn that all like I'd done everything else here with like lots of fine scratches, and it just looked way too contrasted compared to the rest of the drawing. And so what I did is I took that gel pen and tried going over a lot of those lines. And by complete chance, I had drawn the lines of the grass originally with Sharpie. And the way the gel dried on it had like a natural like transparency to it, which created this interesting like bluish purple mid-tone. And I really liked the way it looked, but at the time of doing the comic, I didn't feel fully confident in my use of color. So I ended up just desaturating that drawing. But if you look here, these are original photographs of the bluish look from the gel and the Sharpie. And I really liked it. And I didn't forget that I could have the potential to put color into the comic. But what happened nevertheless was I'd realized how I could use a midtone. Because up until this point, everything was complete contrast, black and white. And realizing this when I got to page 8, I started doing drawings how I normally was before with the pen. But what was nice is I could just lay right over the drawing with watercolor or ink, and it would create this like tone between the contrasting blacks and whites I was using, which became a really big help later on in the comic and figuring out how to paint and where to go from there. The other thing with this page that was really significant to me was testing out what would happen if I used a brush. To be honest, I'm not completely happy with the way this drawing turned out, but I'm glad I kept it either way because it was an experiment that I tried, and it gave an interesting look to the page. And it just like, if I hadn't done this, I don't think I would have gained the knowledge or the confidence to want to paint with brush in the future. So yeah, some of the comic was definitely an experiment, even though it ended up on the final pages. So I now want to take this time to talk more about some of the places I worked on this comic, as well as the materials I used for it. I originally had started drawing this in my bedroom, and then slowly started working on it at public places, very specifically the Parkway Central Library in Philadelphia. I really, really adore this place, not only just for the feel inside the building and the welcoming environment, but they just have so many free resources that I used in creating this project, such as the scanner, like the water fountains, and of course, all the books they have there, which were really helpful as imagery resources and just inspiration. I would also use, for example, like the Barnes and Noble reading area at the Rittenhouse location. And even on one location, on one occasion, I was able to take my stuff to work when I was working as an EMT to the Philadelphia Convention Center, where I was on site during, I think, like a teaching event. And they had an extra table there where I was able to paint. What was so great about my materials is I could really take them anywhere very easily, just in a backpack. And if you look here, the thing I really want to point out is how cheap all of these materials are. Everything here is very affordable, really, except the computer. But even all the programs I was using on the computer were free. Like GIMP, you can download completely for free, and you could probably even use it on a library computer if you really wanted to. All the pens I used are probably $3 or under. And all the paints I was using were beginner paints, or just the cheapest ones they had available. In fact, for a lot of the first paintings with color I was doing, I was completely using a kid's Crayola set. And I thought it worked fine. I still have one today. For the paper, this is another example of not really needing the best materials to still make the artwork you want to make. I didn't realize until a couple months ago what made good watercolor paper. I didn't really realize that it was the cotton that you wanted. And this paper is just 25% cotton, but for me, it really worked. And I originally had drawn everything on 11 by 14 sheets, which I just ran out of by the time I took this picture. But everything was to scale that the comic was in, which is how it ended up being so big. And then I also used tracing paper quite often if I was trying to make some adjustments on my drawings. So page 9 and 10, in my opinion, is where the comic really started coming together. All the techniques I've been using with the midtones and the painting and drawing and just the layering on GIMP like really came to fruition here, I think. The other thing that was really important to me about this page is I started drifting way away from drawing everything quite as literally with the plot and trying to focus much more on what was the feel and symbolism of the story that I was trying to show, let alone just the literal images. And so on this page, a lot of these images are based off the poem that runs in tandem with the comic, which is what inspired a lot of these images. The other thing that was interesting about this page is that part of the reason I ended up making this photo digitally is because the original drawing that went on the top here got completely ruined on the last minute where I was about to take it to the scanner. I had drawn this whole entire page, and by this point, a lot of these drawings were taking like much longer, like 2 months or so. And I was picking it up, and I had a bottle of ink next to it, and I hit the bottle of ink, and it spilled completely over the top of the drawing. And I was so upset about that I laughed. And yeah, I just woke up the next day and cut it off and had to restart. And so to be completely honest, I wasn't super in love with the drawing I'd originally done anyway. So it wasn't like the biggest deal to me, but I tried to use it as an opportunity to try some new things. And it ended up being great that that happened. That was where I came up with the ideas for these drawings during that time. And for the ultrasound, I originally had wanted to paint that, but I decided just to see what would happen if I tried using a real image instead and using GIMP. And so that's where I figured out a lot of the really important layering techniques that I used later on in the comic pages. So on page 10, this is finally where I committed to using color. And that came actually because of trying to improve my use of midtones. I had bought some gray markers and was using them for the stones. And the grays were like, there were some warm grays and cool grays and stuff like that. And when I ended up scanning this drawing, the grays had like natural warm purples or cold blues in them. And it was just so perfect because I'd wanted to use color ever since page 6 with the grass, but I just didn't get how. And I finally felt like this is the page I could do it on because it's so subtle, like the way it's introduced from the last one, that it's not like too intrusive with the comic. The other thing I learned a lot from this page was about the layering. So if you see down here that image of the deer walking through the woods, I can show you now how that was all put together with separate layers laid on top of each other digitally. So I originally started on GIMP with this base image that was done in pencil, and I contrasted it a lot to give it like more of an ink look. And what I liked about the pencil is it's much softer lines than like a pen. And then what I did is I glued salt, like normal table salt, to a black piece of paper, and then scanned the salt and overlaid the salt onto a drawing of this gate, and then was able to delete the salt surrounding the gate image. So it made it look like this like crystal gate. And stuff like that was really fun to figure out because I just realized through that a lot of these drawings have so many more capabilities than just something I can do with a pen or brush. So then once I'd figured that out, I then drew the deer with pen and then laid some of the ink in. And that all together is how you got the finished product on the page there. So for page 11 and 12, this is, there was a huge gap in time between doing pages 10 and 11. And that was partially because of how much I learned the capabilities that I had in this comic and what I could turn it into if I just improved a lot of my skills with painting and color. And so what I did is I started practicing by doing lots of portraits, which was actually where most of the portraits for people I've seen came from, like during that space in between. At the time of doing them, I didn't realize that they would ever be a book. So I just feel lucky that I was able to somehow use them for more than just practice. And with page 11, this is where not only I started really using color, but figuring out way more with the layers and experimenting with more things. For example, this gate is made of actual metal. That's cut wire that's all glued together. And I realized like interesting things I could do with scanning stuff like that, like beyond just drawing and painting. For page 12, this was the first like true full color page in my opinion. And what's still interesting about this is although it could seem like I'd been using color for a while, in my opinion, a lot of these techniques were still really rudimentary. I was still just using like basic lights to darks. Like this river is all maybe like 6 different tones and just really just curvy water lines. And the tree leaves just go from dark to light. It's really just the detail that I think give it this complex look. And then with the drawings down here, these were also originally from those practice drawings I'd done. And I didn't originally have a reason to put these characters into it, but I think they just fit in some interesting way, like this just interesting pair of people. And if you see, like over a year later, I then decided to use them as their own separate images, which ended up becoming people I've seen. So for page 13 and 14, this page took an extraordinarily long time, and not because of just the details, or procrastination, but I just could not figure it out. I had been doing this project for a long time at this point, and this is the last image I finished for either of the books. Um, and I think what happened is I forgot the attitude that I went into this whole entire project with, of just wanting to do something like that was manageable, but also just really enjoyable. And I felt like with this page, I just was setting my sights too high on like wanting to create like the best drawing of the book and like other ridiculous stuff like that. Um, and so I'm happy with the page. I completely am. But I think what it really taught me is the importance of really enjoying your work while you're doing it. I think feeling like you're having fun when you're working on a project will keep you so much more open-minded and lead you to more natural conclusions much faster. I got so obsessed with figuring out this last page that I even ended up scrapping this originally and doing something completely different, which is what you see here, where I wanted this like little house and then bigger house to like grow. And I finished the whole painting pretty much and scanned it. And as you can see, I didn't even lay it together. I just scanned it, looked at it, and realized that what I needed to do was just finish the project. I really learned from these pages that you have to decide for yourself, like you decide everything on your own project, but most importantly, you decide its ultimate vision and when it's going to be finished. And I think I'd been doing the project for so long, I just couldn't decide now it's done and now I'm going to put the period on the end of it. And through doing this page, I really realized that. The other thing I was able to do with it, though, luckily, is that I had originally wanted this to be like the back of the comic, but I realized I could like lay it on top of it and make it like a front cover, which is how that came to be. So now I want to begin talking about people I've seen in the second book. Similar to how I talked about late in the years, I'm going to go through a lot of the process behind the images and what inspired the project and what I hoped it captivated. So to begin, I want to explain with where the front cover came from. I had been working on this project for a while and just could not figure out what the front cover was going to be. I felt like it'd be way too obvious if it was just a portrait of someone. And I just didn't know, if not a picture of someone's face, then what would go on the front of a portrait book. And so I was getting blood work one day, and after the procedure was finished, I looked on the table and saw vials of my blood on the table with my name printed on them. And I'd been thinking about my portrait book anyway, and thought in that moment, how great would it be if that was the cover? Because that's essentially what I'm trying to do by painting a portrait, is capture someone's essence. And when I saw the blood vials, it reminded me of like what I wanted the whole book to be, which was like not only portraits of people's faces, but trying to capture what makes those faces so interesting and what's behind them. So the first portrait I did was this one, which is a nurse at a hospital in South Philadelphia that I had met while I was an EMT. And what really struck me about her is she had this personality that was like so intense and serious, but she was able to be so kind and compassionate with every single patient she worked for. And I really admired her for it. And she never really talked that much, but every time I saw her, I always thought that that's a great example of the type of healthcare provider everyone should want to be. So I was one day at the same hospital again on one of the upstairs floors and saw her picture on the Employee of the Month wall. And this was pretty early on, by the way, in making late in the years, like a couple months into it. And I'd been wanting to improve my portrait drawing skills anyway. And when I saw her portrait, I thought, how interesting would that be if I did a portrait of her and she would never know it exists, but it's in some way like like a personal congratulations to her for what she does, and just a reminder for me of what makes her so great by doing her portrait. And so when I went home and drew it, I ended up adding that butterfly necklace because I wanted her image to represent my impression of her as someone that could be very serious, kind of like the drawing is, with these like sharp white and black lines, but at the same time have a softness to her with the butterfly necklace. And this idea of how I went about doing this drawing ended up becoming the philosophy and driving force behind the entire portrait book. That I wanted to do portraits about that human experience of having people in their lives that don't really know that we think of them or they mean anything to us, but they in some way encompass something that we want to see in ourselves, or we like seeing in other people, or just in some way they're important to us. And it could be of any scale. It could be like a celebrity or a neighbor or just anyone that has some type of meaning to you. So the way the entire book came together is actually because of this person's boyfriend, who was a coworker of mine at a place I was working. And it was her birthday coming up, and the boyfriend, my coworker, wanted a portrait done after he'd seen my work to give to her of her and her son. And so after I did the portrait, he was looking at some of my other ones I'd done and was saying I should just make like a whole pamphlet or something so I could just show these to people and get more portrait consignments. And I thought that was a cool idea, but when I started looking through all the portraits I'd done, I started realizing that I felt like this could be more its own book. Like there was more of a story to it rather than just wanting to make like a random assortment of portraits I'd done. So all of these portraits came from a variety of different sources. Some of them I really did know, and then some of them were faces I'd found on the internet through various websites, such as Facebook, dating sites, or the Doe Network. And what the Doe Network is it's a database for missing persons. And the reason I'd thought to go to this website actually goes back to the themes of late in the years. I'd been trying to work on the page and just trying to get some inspiration for it, and started thinking about this concept of people who are lost, or in some way, like they're lost looking for something in their life, they're literally lost. So I started looking on the site and I found this image of someone that immediately reminded me so much of this guy I used to work with that I really looked up to, similar to the nurse. And the image immediately reminded me of this person and just the time we spent together and a lot of his feelings and thoughts on things. And especially the nickname he used to give me, which is simply Young Guy, in a very endearing way. And so that's where the title of the portrait came from. Young men stall, old men stumble, which is not something he actually said, but I felt like that title along with his portrait really captivated how I saw this person, and kind of allowed me to like be back in those memories when I saw this portrait. And that was very much where the whole idea for how I was going to find these people and talk about them came from. I really like that idea that you take images of people that are some way lost and reconnect them with the viewer in some personal, private way by trying to capture people who have some significance to us personally, even though it's going to be like a private reasons for everyone. So some of the titles came very naturally like the last one. And then some of them, I really had to think for a long time about what I was trying to say and what I felt by looking at them. So what I really just started doing is these are actual notes of my phone, by the way, just writing down random phrases that I didn't even have an idea for what portraits they go to, but I just thought they could be interesting. So for some of them, like collectible and plaster, like I thought those could be interesting, but I just didn't think they had as much substance as like Missing the Snow Globe or the Motorhome's Indifferent, where I felt like when I heard that with a portrait, I really am thinking of them in the more psychological way. Like, what is it about their personality, or where in the world it seems that they are, or how I interpret them, that I can pull out using this portrait title. A good example of that is Regrettable Friendship. I'd originally come up with this idea by seeing these kids on the train that had all these identical shoes and socks. And when I went home and drew it, I ended up adding that shoelace connecting them because I was thinking of friendship. But then I was thinking how tying shoelaces together could especially be like a sign of playing a trick on someone, or how if you have a relationship with someone, you walk away, it's like you both can stumble in the process. And that's how I came up with Regrettable Friendship. And I felt like my criteria for putting all these portraits together and titling them is that I wanted to make sure the titles felt like they in some way added some narrative that there couldn't be without them. So the way I formatted all of these portraits together is I started thinking of the whole book as almost like visiting this town where like not all the people know each other, have anything to do with each other, but by living together in some place, they're all this connected community that in some way has like this underlying influence on each other. And I also wanted to feel like with the portrait book, like every page you were flipping, it almost like you were knocking on a door. Like when you opened up the door, you meet the person and you see a little bit of what their life is like behind their shoulders, but you don't get to fully know them. And that was very much the way I wanted to orient the book, and as along with the titles. And so when I came across these two people, I actually had not planned on them having anything to do with each other whatsoever. But going off that same idea of like people living together or people somehow having a relation to one another, I thought how interesting it would be if this could represent a father and son, or it could be just a young man growing into an older man. And I had not planned this at all. I just, when I saw the two pictures, I noticed how similar like their forehead lines and their eye sockets and their cheekbones all looked. It was like a completely unintentional originally. So I now want to talk about some of the attitudes and ways of thinking that drove me to make a lot of this work and where those ideas came from. And I want to begin that by talking about two specific people that I'd known that really inspired me to make artwork. And the thing that was really special about both of them is that they started making art at a point where they were both amateurs in some way, but didn't let that block them from creating any of the ideas that they wanted to make or stop them in any other way. And that's an attitude I've always really admired about people that can just do things regardless of their skill set. It's just they have the vision or passion in their hearts and they go with it. And those two people are friends of mine named Jack and Johnny. I met both of these people when I was in high school and had found out that both of them were in the process of working on their second movies by only age 16. And when I talked to them more, what really amazed me is that neither of these movies had any scripts. There was barely a plot outline really made. There was no funding for them. Every shot was pretty much filmed and figured out on the spot. Yet regardless of all of those things, both of these movies ended up selling and being relatively successful. Creeps was even sold on DVD in FYE in the horror section, along with like the Halloween and like the Shining and movies like that. And what I really admired about this process is that made me just realize that there's no specific person that makes art. It could be literally anyone with any idea. But what ends up being the people that make art are the people that are just willing to start. It doesn't take someone born with something or just some amazing understanding of film to make a movie. It can really just be anyone with a passionate idea that they really want to see created. And a really good example of this kind of improvisation of ideas and just making up things on the spot as a way of making art really came from the way I watched both of these people make the soundtracks of their movie. One time I was sitting with Johnny and he was showing me a film that he needed a soundtrack for, like for one of the specific scenes, and just immediately on the spot just opened up GarageBand, picked a sound that he thought was cool, hit record, and just came up with the melody on the spot. There was no real planning or anything. It was just complete improvised ideas, all trying to follow this bigger vision. And what was really cool about this track is that none of these are like in tempo, and this is probably completely out of key. But regardless of that, like the song still worked, and it was created in a really beautiful way. It wasn't like thought out to overwhelming points of detail. It was completely based off of that moment of heart and improvisation. One group of people that I think are exceptionally good at this are kids. This summer, I was a art teacher for children ages 5 to 13. And I was always really struck by the difference, but like in a artistic confidence between like a 7-year-old to even a 9-year-old. When doing art with some of the younger kids, like you could come up with anything and tell them to draw it, and just completely on the spot they'd be able to produce this really interesting idea. I remember this one specific time with ghosts, where they were talking about ghosts, and I just suggested that could be their free draw theme, and they just really went in their own amazing directions with it, and were able to just take a crayon and after a couple of minutes have like their ghost with their idea behind the ghost completely created. And there was no overthinking it. It was just completely driven from that, from just their inner vision and self-expression. And I think about how that would have gone if I did that same project with some of the older kids, and how a lot of them would have brought up like, I just can't draw, or I'm just bad at drawing, or I'm not very creative, or drawing a ghost is embarrassing. And how like the amazing difference between those two groups of people, that what it really taught me is that every single person has some type of artistic ability or some type of self-expression. I think what can just really get in the way of it is exactly what got in the way of me wanting to create artwork in the first place. I just kept telling myself, like, I just don't have the skills ready for it, or I just don't know what comic I do, and giving all these reasons that I couldn't do it, rather than just wanting to start and have just a general curiosity about what would happen, which as I've aged, I've seen is often what so many really impressive people in my life were able to overcome. It wasn't that they got the skill eventually. It was just that they stopped caring about how good something was going to be, and just wanted to just make it for the sake of making it. So I want to conclude my presentation by thanking everyone who listened to this. And before I end it, I just want to reiterate that what really allowed me to do this project was in no way improving skills, but it was really just the attitude I had towards making artwork. Once I just realized that there was nothing that was really blocking me from doing things except myself, I was able to slowly gain confidence over time to start trying more and more things. But really, let me tell you, when I started this original first page you see here, I was not at a point where I felt like I was capable of making any sort of comic. And just slowly over time, as I started working away at it, I started being really impressed with myself by what I was able to do. And so to conclude, I just want to say again that really amazing things can happen when people just do things that they don't really feel in any way ready for. Thank you all for watching this presentation. I hope you really enjoyed it. All right, thank you all very much for watching this. I hope you really enjoyed it. I have some time now if anyone's interested to answer some questions. And along with that, if you enter the presentation during it, behind me I have the original artwork from both of these books displayed here at the library. And there's some more of it on the back ends of the displays, but I can show that to answer some questions, and I have the actual books with me as well too. So yeah, if anyone would like to ask me anything, I'm ready. You can also message it in the chat and I'll read it through that way too. If not, Alina, do you have any questions you'd like to say to start?
Yes, I do, but I feel like we didn't have our audio perfectly worked out here. And I'm hesitant to talk. Okay, well, I was wondering if you could, I'm not sure if everybody really got a sense of just the amazing layering that's going on all of your work, and really getting to see your display. So what people are seeing behind you right now, to see how the little pieces come together. For example, you have those hands, and in the final page of the book, it's a totally different layout. So actually seeing you put together this display was amazing, because it seemed like you were creating a new storyline just by rearranging the pieces. So I really hope everybody gets a chance to come see these displays in person. So they're both double-sided. Henry spent weeks putting this together. It was such a treat to see how thoughtfully he arranged the whole thing. Yeah, and you get to see the scale of the paintings. Look at this, it's incredible. So this is that final page that he showed us, but then look at the elements that end up going into the cover of Late in the Years. And here's some of that black and white line work. Yeah, thanks for walking us around the displays.
Yeah, to further explain some of that, if you look here at some of the original pages, trying to orient it right. Yeah, they were much more straight, like one-page drawings where everything was laid out at once, and I started laying a lot more in. So like, if you see, I don't know how well you can see the detail, but like a lot of the, like I put like an image there, and all of the text was like laid in literally on the drawing. And doing this originally was just honestly more convenient, like just than having to like do that by hand. But like by learning that little skill, that's how when you get to like these pages, it was actually interesting because like that was such an advantage with like so many drawings. And I started doing it so much, it got like sort of out of hand. So like what I was talking about with this drawing is I was just realized I could do so much with like the layering that like it was like finding that balance, you know, because like it gave me so much possibilities. But like a great way I was also able to use it was like all these separate items that you see on the front page here. And I don't have the wood panels, but yeah, these were all pretty much painted by hand. And then with GIMP, if you're unfamiliar with Photoshop and stuff like that, there's a tool you can use where you can select like objects, like basically based off of like how dark the tone is, and like lay them on top of each other. Like you can move it as one object, if that kind of makes sense. So that with the layering process, that's where like a lot of these pieces all came together. And yeah, as Alina said, it was really fun putting this all up. It was kind of interesting because like the actual project itself was all like trying to figure out how am I gonna, like, how can I go about like doing the house here and everything like that. And now when I was putting up the display, it was like, how can I take all the pieces of my artwork and like make them into their own pages. So yeah, if anyone has a chance to come, I think it's fun to see it in person for that reason.
So Henry,
how long is
we
the
have a few
exhibit?
questions from people in the chat. If you want to take a look at, there's a question from Jessica about selecting your sketching library locations.
That's a great question. I really can't remember where I first went, like where I first started drawing. As I said, I originally was just doing it at home. And I think I probably went to coffee places, and it was really just for the same reason anyone like studies at like outside of their home, just like a change of scenery, really. And then I'd never been here, like before. I'd never been to this library, I don't think, until I started working on these projects. And the funny thing with it is that I thought you weren't allowed to do that here. I like, they don't explicitly say that anywhere. So, but like no one seemed to mind, none of the librarians or anything or anyone else. So this ended up being my like favorite place, just like the entire setting, just the resources, like the tables are huge. Like it was such a perfect environment. And the thing that's really great, if you ever have a chance to walk through it, is so many people do artwork here. And it's an interesting kind of like unspoken thing. Like I know a couple of them, but it's almost like everyone's own like private thing. And like, I don't know how everyone realizes it, but probably the same way I did. They just start drawing here and then they end up staying for years.
Actually, I missed a few earlier questions. Rick had some really great comments. Could you talk about your familiarity with comics before the first book? Did any favorites inspire you? And also later he asked, you discovered so much about making comics. Are comics your primary medium now?
Yeah, those are really good questions. With comics, like, yeah, I always really loved comics. I I'm trying to think how it all started. I always really liked them very much as a kid. Like I just had like the normal action figure ones. I remember like superhero ones and stuff like that. And then I remembered as I continued reading comics, I started realizing there was some that were way more than just like Superman and stuff like that. Like there was ones that were like much more like emotional. And I think the thing that really captivated me to them was that it was like, it felt like it was telling a part of the story that you don't get through like reading a book, where not only it gives you the imagery of everything, but like you, like a lot of reading comics, and I think I talk about this in the presentation, is like thinking about like the space between the pictures to me. So when I read comics, I really like specific scenes I'll really love from comics are where it's like a really emotional moment. Like there's like Blankets is a really popular comic, and like the breakup, it's a romance comic, and like the breakup scenes are like so memorable because like you're looking through the main character's actual point of view. So like you get like this imagery, I think, with comics that people are, I think, really good at doing them. It's like they know how to find those moments that have a lot of meaning to them for whatever reason, and can kind of like pick those out and lay them together in a story. But for me, when I started doing more of these comics, like I think like that was something I was thinking about, but I think for my comic, like, and a lot of like artwork I really like, it's like the surreal quality to it, where like, and which I think is another thing that like can be tough, at least in a lot of the books I've read, can be tough to do in that same way, where like when you're reading like just like a normal like novel or something, being able to lay so many images together that don't make perfect sense, or like scenes, I think reading it would be confusing. But when you see artwork, it's like you have a different visual processing that like I think goes on. And I think like comics combine that really well. And the other question was about oh, if it's my primary medium. I actually say no. Like I really love comics, definitely, and I've put a lot of time into it. But yeah, with the portrait book, and like I think with a lot of even the ways I went about the actual comic, like I love comics, but like it was more something I felt like was it was more like a means to just draw, honestly. Like I'd been wanting to draw much more when I started the comic, and I felt like by doing one, it would give me a lot more chances to really just do more illustration that I wanted to do. And then same with the portrait book. Yeah, that was originally nothing to do with like a comic. I think it just made so much sense because I'd already figured out how to make books, which in itself can be difficult to like put together. So it's when I knew that, that's how I ended up making the second book. But I actually do have another comic planned. Um, I don't know. I've got other stuff going on right now in my life, but I'm definitely like gonna start putting it way more together right now, and I'm pretty sure it's gonna happen. But yeah, I think once you figure out how to do something like that can take a long time, like a comic or writing a book or something or making music, like it definitely I think is hard to leave it because you realize like you do it once, you realize like the potential to do it again. So it's definitely something I care about and want to do more of, but I wouldn't call it like my main thing when I think of what I spend my time working on.
Henry, I have a couple of comments, not questions, but I love how you said when you talked about spilling the ink, I was so upset I just laughed.
Yeah.
I need more of that in my life. You're talking to a lot of people, I think, that are substantially older than you, and I'm guessing that comment probably resonated with people like, hey, there's a lesson to be learned here from Henry Crane. The other thing is it's kind of blown away by what a deep thinker you are and your ability to take that, contemplate the execution of it in your illustrations, and then deliver it with such detail. So anyway, really so happy to see you and have seen this presentation, and bravo, loved it.
Thank you very much, Vince. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm gonna point out a couple more questions in the chat. From Krista, how long did it take you to do each drawing, and how long to complete the whole project?
Yeah, well,
So Wheezy's on the thing.
oh, wait,
So I
sorry.
like went to her and I sent her a message and say, how easy did
One
you
second.
got?
Just make sure, 1 second, just make sure if you're speaking, you're muted unless you have a question. Yeah, for each drawing, it varied a lot. I think for the earlier ones with like some of like the really heavy details with the drawing and stuff, I actually felt like I could get through that way faster than it might have seemed. I think like just from drawing, sometimes doing those details like that, it can seem like a lot, but I think it ends up not being as much time as it might seem. But I'd say every page I think took at least like a month. And I remember that specifically because I remembered when I'd started, as I'd said, I was so dead set on this being done like so quickly, like 6 months or something like that. And I think I'd planned that because I think I originally thought I could do like a page in 2 weeks if I planned it all out. And that just like, I didn't want to keep it like that to that type of restraint anyway. But yeah, I think in the end, every page is at least a month. And then the watercolor painting took way longer. And I was learning a lot of that too. So in all, I think the planning, the drawing and the laying all the letters together and like the putting the books together, I think was probably like 3 years and like maybe like a little bit longer. And the thing with that too is like, sometimes people have asked me like if I was concerned about that or if I was like gonna be worried because this was gonna take so long. And I think I didn't know, like when I started every drawing, like it wasn't like I was like, all right, month 12 of like 24 more to go. You know, it was just kind of like, I had no idea how long it was going to take. It might have taken like a day, and then some of it may take longer. But I think doing that, and that was what I was doing with when I mentioned that note I put on the sketch page about like drawing stuff better. It's such a like toxic way to think. Like it really doesn't help you at all. Like thinking about like, and I'll do it too. I remember like 2 years into that comic, I was like, man, this is really 2 years. Like this is taking forever. And I think just thinking like that, it doesn't speed anything up. It just makes you feel kind of guilty, you know? And I think also like, what also really inspired that was other comic book creators I like and finding out like, it took like 8+ years for like one book. And like, it's amazing, but it's like, yeah, it's a huge commitment, you know? And I really think like, that can be be so intimidating about stuff is just being like, just thinking about time, but it ends up not even feeling like that much time in a weird way.
You know, Henry, you have so many insights into the creative process, and you know, people are commenting on that as well. It's so inspiring, and I'm so glad that you are teaching art when you were talking about teaching children. So very cool. I think some of what you just said answered Christina's question, but she also asked, do you begin each piece with a sketch to plan it out, or do you jump right in?
Well, I guess, like with this book, I had planned every single page. So like, as I said, I had the story. I wrote the whole story out. Once the story was written out, I then drew a sketch of every single page with the writing. And so by the time I got to the final pages, like everything was already pretty much there. But like, as I'd said, like some of the imagery came later and was just figured out through just like random inspiration. But yeah, everything I notice in the way I do things is I try to plan like as much as possible. Like, and I think it ends up paying off so much because by the time you end up doing it, you've already thought like not only everything out, but you can think like way more about like the symbolism of things and like what you're really trying to like say through doing something. And I think that takes like a really, really long time. Like it I think like the weird thing I think with art that I used to think, especially when I was way younger, is like I used to think like art that I liked was some type of like crazy like spiritual like enlightenment, you know, like crazy inspiration, like it just came out of like nowhere. And like I think what I like, not that I'm saying like anyone should think with what I do, but I think the thing though is like it when you end up spending a lot of time on something like that, you're how to explain it? Like you having so much time to think through something and then create it like the process, you have way more thought in the process. A lot of the details you use and reasons behind it like can make it seem like it kind of like came really quickly or easily. But I really think honestly it's like the more thinking you do, the better when coming up with things.
And somebody had a question about the display. So it will be on view until April 15th. And come to the Parkway Central Library. We're on Vine Street between 19th and 20th. And we're only open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So anytime we're open, stop by to see the display. I don't know if I missed any questions. There's so many great comments. And we're all very impressed with your project.
Hey, Henry, can you just comment on once you were done all this, what did it take to actually print it, get the book printed? How hard was that?
Yeah, so for getting everything printed, I think I got really lucky with how I think I got really lucky with like the printer I ended up using the first time. I had been suggested the printer by someone that had printed their books through them. And when I contacted them, I really didn't get like what was good pricing on printing books or like what was fair and like what was too high. And I think I just got really lucky because I'd like been saving money to do this and like really like I'd really wanted to just finally get it printed once it was complete. And so the person I ended up using, which was by the way called Brilliant Printing, which is in Exton, which I'd really highly suggest if anyone's trying to get anything printed, ended up being like very, very affordable. And then when I went to print I got both books printed through them. And then just to see, I got one of them printed at a different place. And I was like shocked. It was like so much more expensive. But yeah, as far as the process, yeah, I had met with them. I'd show them the work in person that I wanted to do. I just explained kind of like I didn't even really have to explain much because all the pages were already put together. It was really more just a process of having them print a draft, like a proof out and checking that and really just having it all done. I think the hardest part is knowing if you're getting the right thing that you're paying for, which I really just think is like asking lots of places. And it's also hard if it's like, for example, the comic, it was a large size, but yeah, I think I really just got lucky.
Hen, it's Gigi.
Hi, Gigi.
Hi, I love your message about just jumping in and doing it, just trying stuff. I think that's just my favorite message of the night.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was the big message I think I really took away that I wanted to share when I went through making this presentation. So I'm glad that resonated.
Good.
You know, I missed a question from Tom, who says, awesome presentation. Seems like you learned a lot and it was great to see the culmination of your process in the book. Were the dark pages with the castle stone wall done on black paper? It kind of seemed like it because the images are mostly black with white lines.
I actually think most of them were, actually everything was painted on white paper. Yeah, I think that was what ended up being really convenient with using the acrylic, because you like the white acrylic, or not acrylic, the gouache, because you can lay it right on top of things. But I thought about using black paper, but really I was just so comfortable with white, I just didn't really want to switch everything up.
And then there's a question from Doris. Have you made much money from your artwork, or do you plan to in the future? Is this something that's important to you?
Yeah, yeah, everything has gone pretty well with both books as far as like selling them and everything like that. I making these books and like having them produced and everything, like I by no means was expecting like this was going to be like a full-time thing once these books were completed. And the thing about it though that I was mentioning when I first started working on them about hoping to get consignment and everything is that definitely did happen after doing this. Like I've definitely like this is like selling these books is just definitely something that's ended up making me money rather than losing it. But it's also led to these things like consignments and things like that. So it's sometimes hard to judge because like it's not like what I live off of, but it also like at the same time is something that never feels like I'm at this point like having to like take up tons of time to do, or like I'm really like praying I'm going to get more consignments or anything. It's just like it's rolled in pretty nicely. So yeah.
I think that's all the questions, unless I missed somebody else's. Does anybody else want to jump in and ask Henry anything? Gosh, I hope I didn't miss any questions. There were so many comments rolling in so quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was wonderful. So one final virtual applause for Henry. And please stop by and see the exhibit in person. It's really great to see.
Well, thank you all very much for watching this. I really enjoyed doing this. All right, goodbye.